The day my father called me worthless, I was holding a pen that could end his career, or save it. He didn't know the ink on his paycheck, the neat black curve under authorized signature, was mine. He didn't know the password to the payroll system belonged to me either. He only knew the old story he'd told himself for years, that his daughter, me, was slow, soft, and good for nothing. If you're listening, I want you to picture the scene. A fluorescent-lit kitchen, a kettle hissing, my mother shrinking into the wallpaper, and my father's voice sharp as a knife. "You'll never be anything, Lena. Learn to accept it." I could have said it then. "I already signed your paycheck." But revenge, served too soon, is only a confession. So I swallowed the truth and I planned. My name is Lena. I'm 28, a software founder you've never heard of, by design. I grew up in a small house with thin walls and loud opinions. My father, Kareem, believed respect was something you paid up the chain and collected down it. My mother believed in keeping the peace, even if the peace meant silence that hurt your teeth. My dream was simple: build tools that made invisible people visible. Drivers whose hours vanished in messy spreadsheets, janitors who never got the overtime they worked, nurses whose shifts got rounded down. I wanted math to tell the truth when people wouldn't. The betrayal that shattered me didn't arrive as a slap. Came as a sentence spoken on a rainy Thursday, after I'd told him a potential investor would hear my pitch. "Investors," he snorted. "They're not giving money to a girl who couldn't even pass her physics practicals the first time." He didn't ask about the product. He didn't ask about the problem I was solving. He just stared at the thin crack in the tile like it proved something about me. I walked to my room and closed the door quietly, palms shaking, heartbeat in my mouth. Kettle clicked off. The house went very still. And for the first time I saw it clearly. The story he'd written for me and the one I was going to write for myself were about to collide. I wrote code that night until the birds started, line after line like stitches pulling a wound closed. I polished the demo, rewrote the pitch, and scheduled the investor call for 6 a.m. when my father would still be asleep. At 5:58, the sky bruised violet, I pressed join. 6:31, I had a term sheet, small, scrappy, but real. I walked to the kitchen, poured tea, and listened to my father gather his keys for work. "Don't wait up," he said to my mother. "There's payroll trouble again. The company never gets it right." He laughed like people's livelihoods were a sitcom punchline. I looked at his lunchbox, dented metal, a sticker peeling at the corner, and whispered, only to myself, "Not for long." He left, and I dialed another number, this one to the owner of a pale, struggling factory with a payroll system that bled hours like a cut you refuse to look at. "I think I can stop your leak," I told him. "And I think we can both make money." 3 weeks later, I had my first client. 6 months later, I had 5. And 1 year later, the company my father worked for would hand me the keys to the kingdom he worshipped. But that's the future. In the present, all I had was a secret, a scar, and a plan. And a question I'd carry like a hot stone. When the moment came, would I punish him or teach him? I decided to wait. I decided to watch. And I decided to document, because people who call you worthless hate evidence. That afternoon I started a folder on my laptop and named it Pebbles, because pebbles in a shoe don't stop you, they remind you why you're walking. Into that folder went screenshots, bank emails, and voice memos. Not to destroy him. To protect me. To make truth undeniable. That night he came home irritated. "Payroll messed up again," he said, dropping his shoes on the mat. "We'll get a bonus though. They always throw us something when they screw up." I stirred the curry and said nothing. He mistook my silence for obedience. He always had. I lifted my spoon, tasted the heat, and smiled into the steam, because I had just discovered something he didn't know I knew. The company that always screwed up had reached out to a tiny startup to modernize everything. Mine. And the first paycheck with my signature? It would print sooner than he could imagine. The next envelope he'd open at work, white, ordinary, forgettable, would carry my name under his wages. But before that day came, he'd set a fire he couldn't put out. I wasn't born angry. I was born apologizing. When I was 8, my father returned from a long shift and found a B+ on my report card where an A should have been. He lined us up, my mother by the sink, me by the fridge, and delivered a lecture about standards while the tap dripped in slow applause. "You speak softly," he told my mother. "She hears softly." He looked at me. "You'll thank me later." He believed discipline and cruelty were brothers who shared a bed. I believed the bruise of a word lasted longer than the bruise of a hand. As a teenager, I learned to make myself small in all the ways that didn't matter. Smaller clothes, smaller laughs, smaller footsteps on the hallway would. Meanwhile, inside my head, a kingdom grew. I wrote little scripts that sorted the mess of life. My mother's grocery lists turned into memory cues that blinked when items went on sale. My uncle's barbershop tips used a simple algorithm to predict busy days. Nothing fancy. Just honest math performing tiny miracles. The mistreatment began with jokes. "You're the artist," my father would say when I offered to fix the Wi-Fi. "Let a real brain handle it." When our neighbor's son aced his exams, my father congratulated him loudly and patted my shoulder as if I were his public charity. "She tries," he told the boy's mother, as if I wasn't standing there, as if "she tries" wasn't a pin used to keep a butterfly still. At university, I failed a lab practical on a day my mother's blood pressure spiked and I left early to take her to the clinic. I retook it and passed. My father never forgot the fail. He turned it into a story he could lift like a weight whenever he needed to feel strong. "Remember the physics lab?" he'd say with a chuckle, and every time he said it, the room agreed to be small. When I graduated and couldn't find a job immediately, he made sure my waiting had an audience. "You know," he told the cashier at the corner store while I stood beside him, "Lena's trying to find her path." He made path sound like a ditch. He made me sound like a girl who'd lost a shoe. But inside the humiliation was a diamond grit. I took a receptionist job at a logistics company and coded on my lunch breaks. I saved the money other people spent on imported coffee and bought myself a refurbished laptop, then another. I read everything on payroll compliance and labor law that I could get my hands on. I learned how to read pay stubs like palm lines. My father didn't notice the late-night blue on my face or the steady improvement of our creaky Wi-Fi. He noticed control like a hawk notices movement. "Send me your resume," he ordered one evening. "I'll correct the grammar." He cut my volunteer work from it. He deleted the coding projects like they were smudges. "You don't want to sound pretentious," he said. He meant, "You don't want to sound like you surpass me." When the small factory down the road posted a role for an accounts assistant, he insisted I apply. "Stable," he said. "No big ideas needed." I applied and quietly withdrew my application before the interview. Instead, I pitched the owner my product, a lean system that cleaned timesheets, tracked overtime, and synced flawlessly with banks. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said, "Show me." I showed him. 2 weeks later, the overtime discrepancies fell by 83%. The night shift stopped getting docked for clocking out at 12:04 instead of 12 o'clock. A man named Ramesh found an extra $68 in his account and cried in the parking lot where nobody could see. I saw. I wrote his initials on a sticky note and stuck it on my screen. Remember who this is for. At home, things worsened in the way rust worsens, quietly, relentlessly. My father commented on my shoes, my hair, my posture. He audited my life the way some men audit receipts. "If you'd made yourself agreeable," he said one Sunday, "you'd be married by now." Stability. My mother's eyes slid away like birds startled by a stone. I wanted to say, "I'm building something larger than stability." I wanted to say, "Stability for women like me is a cage with pretty curtains." Instead, I bit my tongue and let my work speak elsewhere. Then the subtle became sharp. He borrowed the savings jar I kept in my drawer, our emergency fund, the one I topped up for months because my mother's medication wasn't cheap. "I'll return it after payday," he said. Payday came and went. The jar came back lighter. He'd rounded down his debt to me. That night I started a ledger called Returns. In it I wrote the date, the amount, and a small note. Noted. I wasn't keeping score to punish him. I was keeping score to confirm reality when he came for it later. One evening he asked for my laptop to check something. He returned it with the browser history scrubbed. A single file, my pitch deck, was missing. You didn't have anything important on there, right? He asked. I restored the file from the cloud and made a new rule. Nothing critical lived on a device I couldn't afford to lose. You build sympathy by telling the truth. Sometimes the worst thing isn't a shout. It's a shrug, the refusal to take you seriously, the refusal to believe you could ever be dangerous. I let him believe it. I let him edit my resume and send me job postings I'd already outgrown. I hugged my mother in the kitchen and slid her a folded 20 for her medicine and told her not to mention it. She nodded, guilty, grateful, torn. And then, one night, as rain wrote Morse code on the window, I heard my father in the next room speaking to a friend on speakerphone. He laughed and said, "Lena still thinks she'll be a boss. Let her dream. Somebody has to wash the floors of those dreams." They both laughed. I recorded none of it. I didn't need to. I had the only evidence I'd ever require, the steady flame of my own fury, blue and cool. I closed my eyes and pictured a white envelope traveling down a conveyor belt, a machine arm, a sorter, a bin marked with his department. Inside it, a check printed perfectly. The bottom, above the line, my name. The factory had just hired my startup for a trial. If it worked, they'd move all payroll to my system, and one department would be first. My father's. Betrayal likes to multiply. Once it learns to walk your house, it memorizes the rooms. The borrowing turned into commandeering. My father began treating my time like a utility he could flip on and off. "Drive me to work," he said, though he had a ride, because he liked the feeling of me waiting in traffic while he lectured me on adulthood. He began correcting my emails if he passed behind my chair, even when they weren't to him. He began telling relatives I was between things, like I was a sock that had lost its mate. The financial abuse was petty at first. "Add my phone bill to your card. I'll transfer later." But petty grows fat when it's fed daily. Transfers arrived a fraction short, always with a story. Cashier had no change. ATM limit. "I'll make it up next time." My ledger got longer. I named the second tab stories. He asked me to prepare a CV for him. "You're good at computers," and I did. Took me 2 hours to make him look like the hero he believed he was. In the process, I glimpsed something I hadn't expected. Expense reports from his company that didn't quite align. Receipts that looked copy-pasted, mileage that gave a tired car the legs of an athlete. I didn't accuse him. I Googled petty cash fraud first offense and closed the tab when my stomach hurt. Then came the night everything tipped. My mother called me at 10:11 p.m., voice tight. "Your father took the envelope," she said. The envelope was the rent, cash because the landlord preferred it, counted and rubber-banded, tucked under a bowl. He had taken it for a friend in a jam. He'd return it in the morning, he promised. He didn't. We scraped, begged a 2-day grace and covered it, but something broke inside me that didn't grow back the same shape. At work, my tiny team pushed the beta of our system into the world like a small boat into rough water. We had bugs. We had bad days. We had one heroic client who introduced us to another. We also had a secret pilot at a mid-sized manufacturing firm whose HR manager had the tired eyes of someone who wanted their Fridays back. "If you can fix overtime and get checks out on time," she told me, "I will tattoo your logo on my soul." I nodded and didn't tell her we didn't have a logo. We ran the pilot. In week 2, my father's department assembly came up in the rotation. I knew because I sat in the conference room of that factory in a clean blazer I'd bought secondhand while my server logs crawled like ants on my screen. I watched his name pass through the system. I watched his hours, correct for once, flow into net pay. And I watched as the signature field awaited its ink. I lifted my pen, the cheap kind you steal from a bank, and signed digitally with a weight in my chest I can't describe. The check queued. At home, he bullied my mother over salt. He criticized my voice for being too sharp when I answered a question. He smirked when I mentioned our product. People have been paying people for centuries without your help, he said. You think you invented arithmetic? I stirred my tea and kept my mouth empty of everything but steam. The breaking point arrived as humiliation, as it so often does. My father's company held a small appreciation luncheon for the assembly floor. Families could attend. Wear something decent, he told me. Don't embarrass me. My mother bought a new scarf with money I tucked into her palm. I wore a pressed dress and flats I'd polished with a cloth until they pretended to be new. We sat at a plastic draped table as a manager I recognized from our onboarding calls gave a speech about modernizing systems and respecting hours. I smiled into my cup. My father chattered to his table mates about kids these days and how they text instead of sweat. Then the manager held up a check. Thanks to our new partner, she said, we're getting these right the first time. She named my company. My father didn't flinch. He didn't know the name. He'd never asked. After the speeches, pay envelopes were distributed to each employee in a tidy stack, as always. My father slit his with a thumbnail and slid the check out. He scanned it, nodded once, and folded it away. He didn't look at the signature. He never had. To him, money arrived from a faceless machine. To me, it arrived from the late nights of 5 people and the stubborn belief that invisible work deserved visible pay. On the way home, we stopped for groceries. My father handed me a list and asked me to pay. I'll transfer later, he said, and I swallowed a laugh so sharp it could have cut the receipt. The register, my phone buzzed. A message from the factory's HR. Checks all cleared. One exception flagged, Kareem K., duplicate meal receipts and expense audit. You want us to handle? My hands went cold. I typed back, let me review first. I bagged the onions. I paid for the milk. I carried the bags. I walked behind my father through the rain as if the ground under us wasn't shifting. That night I opened a new folder in Pebbles and named it Fireproof. Inside it I placed a copy of my father's flagged receipts, an audio note of my mother's voice the night the rent vanished, and a photograph of the first check bearing my signature. I looked at the 3 items and understood the shape of the trap I didn't even need to set. He had built it himself. All I had to do was turn on the light. I wasn't broken, I said into the quiet room. I'm angry. HR scheduled a compliance meeting for the assembly floor. New leadership would attend. They asked if I wanted to address the staff. I wrote back one word, yes. If you want to change a system, study its rituals. Paydays, audits, handovers, these are the places where truth and habit shake hands. I learned everything I could about my father's company as a vendor, then as something else. The factory's owner, old, tired, kind in ways that looked like forgetfulness, asked to meet me privately. We sat in his office among potted plants that had outlived entire departments. I'm selling, he said. I wanted to stay local. You know our guts now better than my managers. He named a price I couldn't afford. I swallowed and said, what if I bring partners? He shrugged. I like the way you make things work. Partners arrived like rare birds when you put the right food out. The investor who took a chance on me early introduced me to 2 others. We formed a holding company with a plain name and a fierce heart. I didn't become the face. I became the spine. Papers were signed on a Tuesday that smelled like warm metal and victory. I walked through the floor that afternoon, anonymous in a safety vest, and watched my father at his station tightening bolts with a concentration I recognized from my own work. He looked tired. He looked proud. He looked like a man who believed the world was arranged in a way that served him by default. Keep outwardly submissive, I told myself, even as the ink on the acquisition cooled. People choke on their own arrogance if you give them room to swallow. I went home that night and washed dishes. My mother told me my father had been in a mood at work. The audit had rattled the assembly floor. He says it's nothing, she said, eyes searching mine. A mistake. I nodded and dried a plate. Mistakes can be corrected, I said. Inside, I drafted the agenda for the compliance meeting. Plan used his own habits against him. He relied on poor systems because he could bend them. He relied on people not looking because looking created work. So I built a stage with bright lights and invited everyone to look. First, we ran a reconciliation pass on 6 months of meal and travel receipts across assembly. We didn't target him, we targeted a pattern. His pattern stood up tall. Duplicate meal receipts on days without overtime. Mileage logged on days records placed him at his bench. Nothing grand. Nothing criminal in the felonious sense. Just a man who believed he was owed small extras, if only because the world had denied him big ones. Petty theft, the virtue of the aggrieved. Second, we prepared a training deck explaining the new system. Receipts scanned at point of sale, geotag verification for mileage, a cap for meals with exceptions publicly logged and signed by a supervisor. The message was simple: sunlight. Third, we arranged a public rollout in the cafeteria on a Friday when minds are softer and resistance is lower. We would announce new ownership, new policy, and a retroactive amnesty. Pay back what you shouldn't have claimed and we'll call it even. No shame. No headlines. Just a reset. But men like my father hear amnesty as confession. They think admitting a wrong shrinks them. So to save him, I had to corner him gently. I built one last piece, a personal letter tucked into every employee packet, explaining in plain language how overtime would be protected, how stolen hours would be restored, how paychecks, printed and digital, would carry the same signature until further notice, mine. I didn't sign Lena. I signed with my title, Managing Director, Payroll and People Systems. He would read it. He would see the curve of my name. He would connect the kitchen and the cafeteria and the envelope in his hand. Or he wouldn't. Pride is a powerful blindfold. On Thursday night, I laid my outfit for the rollout on a chair. Dark blazer, hair back, flats I could run in. I printed a single check, not to be cashed, made out to my father for $1. The bottom, my signature. I slid it into a clear sleeve and placed it in my bag next to a flash drive labeled Assembly Training. I slept 2 hours and dreamed of conveyor belts carrying white envelopes like boats under low bridges. Friday noon, the cafeteria filled with the sound of bodies and skepticism. I stood near the back as our COO, my partner, the face, announced the sale. There were gasps, a few claps, a few curses. Then she ceded the floor to me. I walked to the front and felt my nerves melt into a focus so clean I could see my reflection in it. I'm Lena, I said, voice steady. You haven't seen me because my job was to make your hours visible, not mine. If you got paid correctly the last few months, that's us. Not because we're geniuses. Because we think your time shouldn't vanish in a spreadsheet. I explained the new system. I explained the amnesty. I explained that theft starts when people think nobody's watching and ends when everybody is. Heads nodded. Arms crossed. Eyes narrowed. I watched my father in the 4th row, jaw clenched, packet unopened. I finished with the simplest truth I knew. If you worked it, you'll see it. If you didn't, you won't. Then I took out the clear sleeve. I didn't wave it like a flag. I held it like a mirror. Some of you never look at the bottom of your checks, I said lightly. A few laughed. You might want to start. And not because of me, because your name deserves to sit above a signature that respects it. I set the sleeve on the table. Projector hummed. The room breathed. My father finally opened his packet. His eyes found the letter. They slid to the bottom line. He blinked, blinked again, and his face changed shape. He looked up at me as if seeing a door where he'd always believed there was a wall, and he was about to test whether it would hold. Is this a joke? My father's voice cut through the cafeteria like a rip in cloth. The room went hush, the way rooms do when they sense a storm. He stood, the letter shaking just enough for 3 people to notice. What is this signature? He spat the word as if signatures should belong to a specific kind of person and I wasn't it. It's mine, I said, even easy. I lifted the clear sleeve, the $1 check glinting like a trick coin, and held it up so the lights caught the ink. And this is a demonstration check, so no one imagines I forged anyone's name or used a stamp. If you want to see me sign, I'm happy to. I uncapped a pen. I signed a blank line on the back. The gesture wasn't theater. It was a fact made visible. Murmurs skittered across tables. The COO stepped closer to me, present but not protective. This was my stage. I clicked the remote and the first slide of the training deck appeared. 2 columns, old and new. Under old, receipt stapling, handwritten mileage, manager approval as available. Under new, real-time scanning, automated verification, transparent exceptions. We're not accusing, I said, eyes on the room, not on him. We're correcting. But you are accusing, my father said louder, as if volume could make a truth run backward. He pointed at the slide. You think we're thieves. His co-workers stared at their packets, suddenly fascinated by paper. I clicked again. The amnesty slide. We're saying systems tempt people to be less than their best, I said. We're saying we're fixing that. We're saying if anyone has claimed what isn't theirs, they can return it, no questions asked, and we start fresh. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. And if they don't, he asked, do you fire hard-working men feeding families while you play with computers? There it was, the story. Men who work with hands versus girls who push buttons. I felt a small, steady anger rise and settle under my ribs like ballast. I didn't raise my voice. I turned to compliance, seated to my left, and nodded. The HR manager stood, a folder in hand. We ran a test reconciliation, she said, professional calm. Not targeting anyone. Just a sweep. We found a handful of duplicates and mis-entries. We've already had 2 employees step forward to correct them. She paused. We also found a pattern in assembly, small but consistent, of duplicate meal receipts attached to non-overtime days. She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. The room shifted like a boat sensing a change in current. I stepped forward. This is where it becomes like a courtroom, so let's be clear about what the evidence is and isn't, I said, projecting to the back. It isn't a character judgment. It isn't a condemnation of long careers. It is dates, times, amounts. I clicked to the next slide, anonymized examples on screen. 2 identical receipts at 12:13 p.m. posted on different days, the same merchant number, the same terminal. Another set, same pattern. This happens, I said. Sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes it's habit. We don't have to decide which. We have to correct it. My father's mouth thinned. He looked down at his packet and saw the signature again, maybe for the first time. He didn't look astonished. He looked offended. So you're above me now, he said, not to me but to the room, as if seeking co-signers for a loan his pride had taken out. This is what happens when children aren't taught their place. I walked to the table, set the clear sleeve down, and slid a plain folder beside it. I was taught my place, I said softly. At the sink. In the corner. Behind the man who collects the applause. I learned other places too, server rooms, code repositories, bank gateways. Places where truth travels whether men approve it or not. I opened the folder. Inside were 3 things: the amnesty form, a repayment plan template with modest terms, and a single page showing how overtime hours had been restored in the last month because of the new system. Names blacked out, numbers visible. This is the point, I said, tapping the hours. If you worked it, you get it. If you didn't, you don't. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone. I came to say, the era of vanishing hours and invented meals is over. Silence. Then a chair scraped. A man from the 3rd row, Ramesh, stood, packet in hand. I had a duplicate, he said, voice trembling but sure. I didn't know it would go through twice. I already filled the form. He held it up. Another man stood. Then a third. Not a wave, a slow tide. My father's face reddened. He saw his reflection in their courage and mistook it for an attack. "You're all fools," he snapped. "You think she's doing this for you? She's doing this to feel big." He pointed at me, fingers shaking. "Worthless," he said, a reflex like a cough. "Always has been." The word hung there, the oldest weapon in the house, dull from use and still dangerous. I could have thrown 100 facts at it and watched them shatter. I chose one. I lifted the clear sleeve, slid out the $1 check, and held it up next to his face so the camera of every eye in the room could frame the shot. "This is not about feeling big," I said. "This is about grown-ups doing grown-up things. You asked what happens if people don't return what isn't theirs." I looked at compliance. "Tell them." The HR manager didn't flinch. "If anyone declines amnesty and continues to submit false claims," she said, "they will be suspended pending investigation. Repeated offenses will result in termination. No exceptions." She looked at me. I nodded. "No exceptions," I echoed. My father opened his mouth. Closed it. The room was no longer his. It was ours, the honest workers, the new systems, the plain math. He sat. He didn't sign. He didn't speak. He stared at the check in my hand like it was a small animal he didn't know how to hold. After the meeting, compliance sent me a list. 5 employees had already returned amounts. 1 had refused and stormed out. 1, my father, had neither returned nor acknowledged. We had to decide by Monday, suspend or warn. Consequences are a language, and people who've never been made to read it always call it foreign. Monday morning arrived with the metallic taste of decision. I sat with the COO and HR in a glass room that made honesty feel like a performance. We reviewed the list. We were gentle where we could be, firm where we must. For my father, we agreed on a path we offered to everyone: a formal warning, a repayment schedule, ethics training, and a probationary period. Not because he was my father, because that's what we'd decided was right before his name ever appeared. The HR manager slid the letter across the table. "You sure?" she asked me quietly. "No exceptions," I said, feeling the sentence like a stone in my hand. "Not even for blood." He received the letter at noon. He didn't come home that night. He called my mother from somewhere loud and said it was an insult. He said I was embarrassed by where I came from. He said a lot of things to fill the space where an apology might have lived. My mother cried quietly into a tea towel. I sat with her and read the letter aloud, line by line, as if reading it again could blunt its edges. "They aren't firing him," I said. "They're offering a bridge." She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. Love is a complicated translator. By Wednesday, word had spread. Neighbors looked at my mother with questions disguised as kindness. Aunties who'd once praised my father's discipline now praised his sacrifice rather than confront his stubbornness. At the factory, something else happened, something like weather shifting. People began to use the scanner correctly. Overtime rose where it should. Petty cash drawer stopped hemorrhaging. In the break room, men who'd once rolled their eyes at policy now rolled their hands over pay stubs that finally made sense. One afternoon I passed Ramesh in the corridor. He stopped, nervous, and said, "My kid's tooth needed a cap. I could pay for it this month." "Thank you." He waved the receipt as if to prove that this time paper carried mercy. I went to the restroom and cried quietly, not because of the thanks but because the math finally matched the life. My father continued refusing the bridge. He wore his suspension like a medal. He told anyone who'd listen that his daughter had humiliated him in public. He did not mention the rent envelope, the duplicate receipts, the years of small cuts. Pride is a poor historian. Then the thing greed always does happened. It trapped itself. In his anger, he filed a complaint with the Labor Bureau claiming the company was retaliating against him for questioning the new system. He attached copies of his correct receipts as evidence. The investigator assigned, A woman with tidy handwriting and a face that looked like it had heard every story called us in. We brought logs. We brought geotags. We brought the amnesty policy. She looked at everything the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. "Mr. Kareem," she said finally, voice neutral, "would you like to withdraw your complaint and accept the company's terms?" He huffed. He insisted. He left the office paler than he entered. The ruling came a week later, complaint dismissed. His pattern documented. His suspension extended. Probation required. Repayment mandatory. The letter was polite, clinical, merciless. He didn't speak to me for 3 days. On the 4th, he sent a text. "We need to talk." We met in a small cafe where the coffee tasted like burnt almonds and the chairs wobbled. He arrived first, arms crossed, eyes like shutters. "You planned this," he said without greeting. "You waited to humiliate me." I ordered tea and let the accusation hover until it lost heat. "I plan to fix a system," I said. "I plan to make sure men like you get paid for what they work and only what they work. You were the one who planned that." I slid a photocopy of the duplicate receipts across the table. He flinched, not because of the paper, but because the paper didn't care how loud he spoke. "You think you're better than me," he said. "I think I'm responsible for everyone," I said. "Including you. That's why you still have a job if you want it." He stared at me then, real-looking, not the kind he did to inventory my flaws. Something old and sharp in his face softened by a millimeter. "You put your name on my check," he said, wonder and affront braided together. "I put my name under your work," I corrected. "That signature is a promise, not a trophy." He exhaled. It sounded like a winter door. "I can't sign the repayment," he said finally. "Not because I can't pay. Because," he swallowed a word I'd waited my whole life to hear. "Because if I do, I admit I was wrong." He stood, placed both palms on the table, and looked at me like a man on the edge of a pool who can't swim. "What do I do then?" he asked, small cracking. "Practice," I said gently. "Start with this, you were wrong. Then work your way up to, I'm sorry." He left without signing that day. But the next morning, HR forwarded me an email. The subject line was one word: repayment. The attachment was a scanned, signed form. The signature slanted like a man learning to write with his non-dominant hand. Cliffhanger. He asked to see me at home that night. No cafe, no audience. My mother set 3 cups on the table, hands trembling. He was going to say something he'd never said before. I didn't know if I was ready to hear it. The apology landed like rain after months of dust. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just wet and necessary. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen, hat in his hands, and didn't perform. "Lena," he said, and the way he said my name made me look up. "I have been cruel." The room didn't gasp. Kettle didn't shriek. The only sound was the clock, steady as a vein. "I took money that wasn't mine," he continued. "I took pride that wasn't earned. I took your belief in yourself and used it when I was tired. He swallowed. "Sorry." You imagine apologies will erase you and remake you in a single clean motion. They don't. They lay a plank over a hole and invite you to step. I nodded, because nodding was the only movement I trusted. "Thank you," I said. "The work isn't the apology. The work is what comes after." He nodded back, as if learning a new grammar. What came after was not perfect. He still bristled. I still bruised. But he showed up for ethics training. He returned the money. He stopped borrowing. He looked at receipts before submitting them like a man checking a stove twice. He started tentatively to ask about my work in sentences that didn't end with jokes. "How many workers does your system pay now?" he asked one evening. "Enough to keep me awake," I said, and he smiled like he understood for the first time that my sleeplessness was a kind of love. To factory, people adjusted. The scanners became habit. The amnesty box emptied. Petty cash drawer balanced. We caught a supervisor trying to game the mileage logs, and we caught him in the same net we'd built for everyone else. When he protested, the room said the same sentence together. No exceptions. Felt like a choir. I found peace in small ways. A plant on my desk that didn't die, a keycard that opened every door but a heart that didn't need to. I replaced my flats with a single pair of shoes that felt like my own. I learned to sit in meetings without shrinking. I learned to speak in rooms where men listened because the system made them, and then, slowly, because they wanted to. I made time for the things I thought I'd left behind. Long walks at dusk, cooking for friends, the clumsy beginning of a relationship with someone who looked at my ambition like a sunrise, not a siren. And my mother? She grew taller. Not physically. In presence. She stopped translating for my father and let him learn our language. One afternoon she brought me a small box. Inside was the dented lunchbox my father had carried for years, sticker peeling at the corner. He said to give you this, she said, smiling. Says he wants a new one. Says he wants to put your sticker on it. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because sometimes you have to laugh when the world finally decides to be strange in your favor. You want a clean ending. We all do. Here's the truth. Revenge is not the fire. It's the light you switch on. The fire was always there, in the engine of a system that ate hours and spit out excuses, in the brittle pride that called me worthless because it couldn't imagine my worth. The revenge was building a structure where my father had to look at himself and either walk across the plank or fall. He walked. Slowly. Imperfectly. But he walked. On the day he returned to full duty, HR handed him a plain white envelope. He opened it in the break room, finally looked at the signature and nodded once. Wordlessly, he walked to my office door. He didn't knock. He stood in the frame like a man approaching a temple. I looked, he said. I saw. He swallowed. Thank you for putting your name under mine. I shook my head. It's not under yours, I said softly. It's under your hours. He blinked and then he laughed, really laughed, not the sharp kind. Then he did something I'd never seen. He put his hand on his chest and bowed a little, a gesture older than his temper. I won't tell you we became best friends. I won't tell you he never slipped. I'll tell you we built a life with more truth in it than fear. I'll tell you I learned to choose what kind of daughter I wanted to be, not the kind he required. And I'll tell you something I wish someone had told me at 8, at 18, at 28. Every scar tells a story of survival. Keep fighting for your truth. If this story found you when your house is loud and your voice is small, I hope you heard the quiet part. You don't need permission to become the person who signs the checks, literal or metaphorical, that used to bounce. If it helped, tell me in the comments what you're building in the dark. And if you want more stories like this, raw, honest, and a little bit dangerous, hit subscribe. Your time matters. I'll make sure it shows up.